Costing the global economy $5 trillion every year, fraud is big business. In the digital age, fraudsters are constantly evolving and exploiting new vulnerabilities, and staying ahead and protecting your business can feel like an insurmountable challenge. That's why we founded the Fraud Lab, to deconstruct attacks, mimic behaviors, and share insights with our partners. In this podcast, I'll be talking with business leaders and policymakers about their experience, the fraud landscape, and what's coming next. I'm your host, Simon Horswell. Welcome inside the Fraud Lab. In this episode, I'm joined by David Burroughs, a partner at Stoneturn, a global professional services firm that provides expertise with forensics and investigation, risk and compliance, data and technology, economic and dispute advisory, and strategic business consulting. David brings over 30 years of law enforcement, public and private sector experience in fraud and forensic investigations, security threat and risk assessments, compliance and risk management, and monitorship. He's also a 25-year veteran of the Federal Bureau of Investigations. So in today's episode, we dive into insider risk, what it is, what are the motivations behind it, and what are the red flags to look out for. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Inside the Fraud Lab is brought to you by Onfido. Onfido's real identity platform is trusted by thousands of businesses to stop fraud and know their customers. Their AI-powered identity verification means businesses can securely and seamlessly onboard customers anytime, anywhere.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Simon Horswell. And David, thank you for being with me today.
My pleasure, Simon.
Shall we kick things off? I think the first thing we should do, we've said we're going to talk about insider risk. This might be a new term for people who are listening. So let's define some of those terms. What do we mean by insider risk? And maybe we can have a couple of real world examples.
Sure. I mean, insider risk has a lot of definitions, but, generally speaking, it's really anyone. And that could be an employee, a subcontractor, a partner of the organization, who has access to information and or assets and maliciously or unwittingly exploits that access and in order to and basically expose those assets.
Someone inside the circle of trust, as it were.
Yes. And they sort of break down insiders into two categories. I mentioned maliciously, and an example of that, recently last year, there was an individual in the Air Force who, a very young, like 22, I believe, year old individual, probably was the equivalent. I think he was an airman, but his rank was equivalent to that of a private in the Army. And he had allegedly exposed hundreds of top secret documents to friends of his in a gaming group. And one of those friends then, I think, shared those documents on another server, and They became public, and creating a very serious security risk to the country. So, in that kind of situation, he was considered a malicious insider. He took this information, disseminated it, and knowing full well the consequences that may result from that. And an unwitting insider is someone who doesn't intentionally create damage or harm. And, probably the most common example we can all relate to would be an individual who inadvertently clicks on a phishing link, believing it to be legitimate, enters certain credentials, and then all of a sudden exposes the network. So they still pose a risk, but it's not something that was intentional. Right.
I suppose kind of like maybe it sits somewhere in between these two, but so you've got your nefarious, you've got your unmalicious. What about someone who's subject to some form of coercion, like blackmail or extortion?
Yeah, I think in those situations, they may be resistant but they're in a position in which, they may be, if they don't have a situation where they feel there's an outlet for them to report this or to seek help, they in a sense become a malicious insider.
Right, because of the intent. They're doing
Exactly.
it knowingly as opposed to
Right.
unknowingly.
Correct.
Okay. So what kind of things would motivate an insider to act in this way? What are the kind of motivations behind it?
They're sort of generalized into several categories. One is psychological, and by that I mean, individual can be angry, depressed, there's some emotion fueling the act. It could even be something as simple as they feel slighted because they didn't get a promotion, something along those lines. One of the big ones is financial. An individual may be experiencing debt, from could be a medical family illness situation. It could be due to various addictions, whether it be substance abuse or perhaps gambling, those types of things that they incur problems. Living beyond one's means is one that gets a lot of people into trouble. And then there's, good old fashioned greed.
Just wanting to get a little bit more in the pot. And I think, they're all quite timely, but I think more and more, given the current climate, we're likely to see the last one you mentioned probably.
And on top of the financial, there's relational, which you just kind of alluded to earlier, in which, you're approached by colleagues and they either sell you on the idea to participate or they do something to compel you to do it, whether it be through physical violence, whatever the threat may be. And so they can sort of create a situation where the person feels they have no choice but to comply. And then there's situational, and that's usually where you have, I think in many respects during COVID, that increased a little bit because you're working remote. The situation is you're by yourself, you're isolated, and, there's a less likelihood potentially that you're going to be caught by a colleague. Maybe there's controls in place, but you're sort of on your own. Also ideological, where you may have a strong belief. Say the company you work for is, in your opinion, dumping
evil or
pollutants into the river or something. You may feel that, an insider, it's not just it's not just embezzlement or things like that. It could also be sabotage, to stop what's going on or to cause reputational harm in order to, slow down or change what they feel is, improper. And then last is environmental, at least in the categories we're talking about here, which by that we mean, poor controls, a poor culture, in the organization can serve to motivate individuals who feel that, even if they do something and try to commit some type of act, that there's less than a likelihood that their colleagues are going to report.
Right. So company culture sort of comes into this as well then.
Oh, I think it's a key factor. Your technology is only going to take you so far.
Yeah. But so keep your employees happy. If you had no other reason,
Well, that's a tough challenge, but
yeah.
I think to make employees feel, I think to make them feel valued, that their voice can be heard, and that they want, I think in a good culture, in a culture which you create, sometimes it's referred to as a speak up culture, where people feel comfortable or safe to report things that concern them without fear of retaliation or consequence. I think those types of things serve as a huge deterrent, because if an individual is working in an environment where everybody, is sort of rowing in the same direction, they want to succeed, they want their company to succeed, and they're happy in their workplace, they're going to say, hey, I'm concerned about something I saw, and it may be innocent, but I just think I should bring it to your attention. Whereas if employees either aren't happy or they don't feel that the management, the one responsibility on management in that regard in particular is to follow up on those reports. Because if I've been in environments where people don't report because they go, they're not going to do anything. So why should I waste my
the
time?
complacency.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that does kind of lead on to the next area I wanted to discuss as well. So it's, I mean, we're talking about effectively whistleblowing as being one way that these people, that these insiders get caught. What are some of the other ways that they get caught? I mean, what are some of the red flags that we should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, there's, red flags are usually most apparent in hindsight, although they're there. But I mean,
Yeah.
afterwards, we all look at ourselves, whether it's
All the signs were there.
yes,
Yeah.
how did they miss this? That kind of thing. But in the moment, sometimes they're overlooked for a variety of reasons. But certain things, and some of them almost sound similar to the motivations. But I think one of the big ones is sort of personality changes, where you see the demeanor of an employee changes. They all of a sudden they're antisocial with colleagues, or their interaction changes, their performance may plummet, their financial habits may change,
They suddenly drive into work in a sports car. Yeah.
We talked about performance and financial habits, but oddly, we've had situations I've encountered in the past where someone, said never wanted to take a vacation, and that was because of the fear of, if they were away, what they were doing might be discovered. So, your most loyal employee all of a sudden is not. And sometimes the employee is always the first one in, last one out. That could be a very loyal and hardworking employee. It doesn't mean they're a malicious insider, but it's something that, is there a reason, besides just working hard, that conduct is going on. Sudden interest in a work area other than their own, sort of all of a sudden, why are you over on this side kind of a thing. It could be an indication where there's something there that they're seeking or trying to get access to. The cautionary statement I wanted to make is, red flags can be strong indicators, but we are all human beings, and we all go through things in life that impact us. And so, people cannot be quick to assess and point a finger just because certain characteristics are popping up. There's more of a totality of circumstances that before you start, accusing people of doing something wrong just because they're going through a difficult time.
Exactly. It's so these flags in and of themselves aren't necessarily evidence that something's going on,
right?
But they're potentially a clue if you become aware that something is going on. Or,
yes.
I mean, we're not saying that anyone should just ignore them, put them down to human behavior. It means to start to monitor the situation in a professional manner a bit more closely.
Yes, and I think earlier we talked about sort of the cultural aspect. If there's strong relationships, people are more inclined to sort of say, what's going on in their life, or at some point share it, and then you can sort of support them.
Okay, so basically, you recommend going out for a drink with colleagues, possibly on the company's expense, because ultimately it's going to stop insiders.
Well, and drinks don't always have to be alcoholic. So yes.
No, of course. A lot of what we've just talked about there is us as humans keeping our eyes on the prize, as it were, watching out for each other, watching out for any changes, which we should all be doing as part of a cohesive team anyway, because it could be an indication that something else is going on in someone's private life and not just insider threats. So these are kind of just general flags to keep an eye out for. But what about the role that technology has to play in both? Well, not just in creating the opportunities for insiders, but also I think, given all the press that we see around AI at the moment, and I keep saying it, but it's like a demonization of AI. It's very easy to overlook the good that it does as well. So what's maybe some of the role that technology can play in helping to protect or mitigate the risk of insider threat?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And fortunately, I'm part of a multiple disciplinary firm where, the investigations group can work with the cyber group, and, we all work, and the computer forensics, so we all work collaboratively. So I certainly have colleagues who can speak much more intelligently on this topic, but I can say basically some mitigating factors are, like security tooling and expanded logging are becoming more common. There's EDR, endpoint detection response, which are tools that help figure out sort of what happened to in the individual system, if the files are still actively out, or and what happened to or actively on the device, what USB devices were connected, so it sort of captures that activity. One of the other areas that sort of along those lines is the security information management system, or SIM platforms, which help correlate activity across the systems and log formats. So that's another sort of centralizing factor, I guess, to detect or flag certain things.
So we're talking about monitoring there, and I suppose at the same time, given the descriptions that we've already talked about, where you've got your unmalicious, then obviously at a very basic level, a good spam filter would be quite handy. But what maybe are some of the the key parts that technology plays in creating more opportunities for insiders as well?
Yeah, I mean, and some of them, as you just pointed out, aren't all malicious. For example, the use of ChatGPT. There was an article written recently regarding, I think doctors were using ChatGPT to help organize their notes and their reporting. And what they didn't realize was that in doing so, it exposed confidential data in violation of the HIPAA laws, because once it goes out on the AI servers,
then anyone can access it.
Yeah, so it was problematic.
And they do put a disclaimer for that, to be fair.
Yes, yeah, no, it's out there, but that's the risk, is individuals using new technology when perhaps they maybe have not been educated fully in the potential pitfalls and consequences.
Okay. Any other opportunities it creates? So maybe we've talked about the unmalicious, the accidental, if you will. But maybe are there any opportunities it potentially creates for the malicious insider?
With generative AI, for example, in addition to sort of the risk of accidental exposure, you could have employees trying to use it to subvert security controls, such as, although AI, they try to make an effort to, there's security protocols in there so that if you ask, how do I rob a bank, it's hopefully not going to give you a response, but you can sort of reword questions, so there's a way they can subvert, might be able to subvert security protocols, using it.
Okay, we won't advertise any of those. I think what I'd like to talk about as well, it's not often you get to talk to someone who used to work in the FBI. And when you do, I've got loads and loads of questions, but I'm going to keep it nice and straightforward. So what were some of the biggest surprises from your time at the FBI, and maybe some of the biggest lessons that you learned from that?
Yeah, it's a hard question, because I would say there's a lot of them, and some I probably don't even, that don't come to mind right away. But I think, one of the things that just always sort of surprised, or just kind of caused me to scratch my head, was just how many people who are so gifted and incredibly intelligent would choose to use that gift, if you will, to try and defraud, or not to get corny, but use their powers for evil, when they probably would have had an incredibly successful career in the private sector, or whatever path they chose. But they choose to to use it to beat the system. I just felt it was a sad choice that they made, if that makes sense.
Right. I mean, we could philosophically argue that everything is ultimately your own choice, but maybe it's more the opportunities that were presented to them at the different times, right? So if they'd met a different person, or gone to a different school, or they'd had a manager that had talk to them a bit differently, then they may well have gone down that more positive route and been more of a commercial success, let's say.
Sure.
Whereas if you're kind of backed into a corner, sometimes you'll do whatever you have to do to survive, or you will take the easiest route is quite often the other one. So it's yeah, I get what you mean. It's always shocking when you sort of see someone so talented or such a brilliant mind used for something more nefarious. It's
Yeah. And then you sort of asked sort of the biggest lesson I learned, and I think for me was really, and fortunately for me, because I feel I am this way, the role that compassion plays in dealing with people at various points in their lives, and that could be anyone from the victim of a crime to the perpetrator. And I have found that while I was an FBI agent and then retired and in the private sector, that being able to talk to someone and empathize with them, sort of regardless of the circumstances, and not doing so in judgment, is probably, for me, one of the most sort of impactful ways to relate to people. And I think that translates into how I interact with, whether it's clients or individuals, insiders, or individuals who were breaking the law that we're investigating. It really has sort of just been tremendously impactful to my life, and I think to my, I'd like to say to my success without being boastful.
well, yeah, I can imagine it's very easy to say it, but it's a lot harder to actually do it. As you say, in certain circumstances, keeping that compassion and still seeing the person as a person instead of the villain of the piece that takes a lot of self-control.
Yeah, I mean, I think fortunately for me, it's just the way I was sort of wired, the way my parents raised me. So it's not a self-control issue. It's really just it's just sort of how I operate, and I can, as a quick example, I did a white collar for about 7 years, and then I worked violent street gangs for about 8 years. And I remember very vividly on one arrest that was made. I was sitting with an individual who was believed to have committed a few homicides, and I was talking to him, and he stopped and he just said, that I was the first cop, that ever treated him like a human being and with respect. And and I just said, well, I have no reason not to. I'm not the judge of what you've done. I said, we'll see what happens with that, but as long as you treat me with respect while we're together, that's how I operate. And he ended up going to trial and lost at trial, but every morning we said hello, and it was people around us couldn't understand why they felt that I was being too nice to him. But
no, but it's more effective. That's the point. You see this time and again. It's it's particularly when someone's already in custody, right? That's at that point, it's okay to just treat them like a human being. It's like, well, what's going to happen is going to happen,
Yeah, usually it's still pretty adversarial at that point, depending on the circumstances. But that was something for me was very powerful.
Yeah, no, I can see why. So one question I've always kind of asked someone in your position is probably what was the most interesting or elaborate fraud case that you were a part of?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. There's several. As far as fraud, sort of going along the lines of Insider, I had one interesting case in which involved some various auto sales facilities, and what happened was there were certain individuals inside who were stealing vehicle identification number information off their computers, and then they were using that in an organized fashion with I think a group of about total 15 individuals involved in this scenario, in which they were using that information to negotiate rebate checks that were being offered for the purchase of new vehicles. So they were stealing Division of Motor Vehicle records, in order to complete the rebate checks, and then they would disseminate the rebate checks throughout sort of the New York City area, Staten Island, and things like that. And so you had insiders at the dealerships, then you had individuals on the outside distributing and negotiating the checks. And it was a very interesting investigation, which eventually many of the individuals, I think we arrested about 15 to 16 individuals, and if I remember correctly, and several went to trial and were all found guilty at trial. So it was very interesting, as far as an insider standpoint. And I also had another case in which there was an individual who was working inside a major U.S. bank, and there was a control issue, and they tested the system by submitting a bill payment, their own bill for a household, sort of a household utility. Yeah. And it went through, wasn't flagged, and so they did it again, sort of testing the system. Always, you could always say, "Oh, I made a mistake," and then just it was off to the races, and they ended up embezzling between $3 and $4 million. And
over how long a period of time?
I believe it was less than a year, if I remember correctly. And bought a lot of automobiles, homes, a lot of nice things. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if the individual, was never clear to me, if the individual inadvertently made that first payment submission,
or if it's something they'd thought about
and said, "I bet you they won't. Yeah, I'll test it, and I can always fall back on it was a mistake." But it was one of those things that quickly pointed out the vulnerability and the lack of control, which the bank immediately remedied, and the bank worked with us very closely to resolve the issue. But it was pretty interesting.
So, I mean, there's a couple of those red flags there. Slight change in behaviour. Certainly a lot more finances being spent.
Living well beyond their means, yes.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. What would have been the longest case you've worked on?
Yeah, in this case, I played a very minor role and wasn't even involved with it at the beginning, but it was a very highly publicized FBI investigation that I think culminated in 2011, and it was called Ghost Stories. And this case was probably about the ultimate insiders. They were Russian operatives that came over into the U.S. and blended into society in different roles. Some had family here, had children here, and were living among us, so to speak, similar to with a lot less drama, but similar to the Americans.
I was going to say, it's like the TV show, The Americans.
Yeah, not quite as exciting as that, but they did pose a risk, and it was really a 10-year investigation that the FBI had into these individuals, between identifying them and, like I said, I don't begin to take credit for that. It was done by our counterintelligence squads that focus on it, and our special operations squads and surveillance squads. There was just a massive effort, and other agencies involved. But I had the benefit of sort of coming in on the last couple of years and supporting it through technical means. So it was fascinating. And these individuals were arrested, and ultimately they were exchanged for Americans who and they did that was done at the airport. It was kind of a dramatic handoff. But I would say that, knowing the complexities of that investigation and just some of the things that we dealt with from a technical perspective, it was sort of fascinating. And it's one of those things that I think as a society, you think the Cold War is dead and all that kind of stuff, and yet here we have right in our own neighborhoods.
It's more just lukewarm now, you know. It's just
I'm not.
tepid.
I don't have access to that information anymore, Simon, so I don't know.
I was gonna say, not so much cold. It's just room temperature. One of the last questions I like to ask people is, how do you see the fraud landscape changing in the next few years, say the next year, the next 5 years? What do you think are going to be some of the major changes? What are we going to see happen?
Well, I think, with the advance of AI, and ChatGPT, I think you have the technological advancements, as we know, as soon as new technology is invented, it's almost it wasn't intentional, but how I started this as far as when you asked me one of the things that was sort of the most surprising or something that I learned in the FBI was the issue of how individuals who are so talented, choose to try and defeat the system of whatever, and I think that as this technology advances, so will the sophistication of the individuals. So I think it's really going to be interesting as everything becomes more digital, but, at the same time, I still think there's going to be, there has to be a human factor, at some point as these different advancements occur. All of a sudden we're getting to a point now where if you do get a phone call from your bank, you don't believe it. You don't know what to believe. So, you need to hang up. You need to have a human interaction with someone that is at your bank, and you can't call the number back that they called from. You've got to look it up online and,
Exactly.
Go through that way. So
from a trusted source.
Yeah. So I see sort of a situation where, not everyone is so technologically proficient, that they are going to advance with this. But I think that there's always going to be a human element to it. But as far as crystal balling it, I don't know. I don't have a full appreciation yet of just how advanced ChatGPT and AI is going to get. But I'm fortunate, as I alluded to earlier, to have some individuals, many individuals in the firm who work in that specific area that I can rely on to tell me, all right, what's going on.
Well, I think that's one of the things for me. It's this idea of people taking something that's out there, which is just a tool, but using it in ways that hasn't originally been envisaged. Mm-hmm. And that's what we see with any of these scams. It's like you take a particular piece of technology, you start using it in a way that no one really thought you would use it, and that's how you start to leverage that advantage. Or you look at a system and just a series of processes, and then you say, right, okay, well, that creates these loopholes, and that's where my advantage is. So I think that's where the human element is, right? That's the whole point. You just gaming the system is very much the human aspect of all fraud. It's
well, and some of it, it's not always financial. Some of it is just to the thrill of beating it or defeating it. Some people get a high of just navigating and defeating it and saying, what's next? I'm smarter than you.
Brilliant. David, thank you so much for your time with us today. I've really appreciated it. It's been fascinating to listen to. Really enjoyed it. Where can listeners find you online to learn more about you and your work and Stoneturn?
Sure. Yeah. And they could reach our firm, which is at www.stoneturn.com. Stoneturn is one word. Mm-hmm. Or on LinkedIn. We have a pretty strong presence on LinkedIn, and I believe we have a newsletter that they could subscribe to, and we also there's a lot of thought leadership that's offered by
I've been reading your articles, so I've enjoyed them very much.
Oh, thank you. Well, we're collaborative, so I have help as well. So
looks off camera.
giving some kudos. Yes, I mentioned the culture, but also we don't compete against each other. We sort of all work together. I'm very fortunate.
Great. David, thank you so much. Thank you, really.
Thank you, Simon. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on this journey inside the Fraud Lab. If you'd like more insights into attack patterns and trends as we see them at Onfido, head to onfido.com or click the link in the show notes to access our annual identity fraud report. It's full of proprietary research into how fraudsters are attacking identity verification and how the world of prevention is changing. It's full of insights. For example, financial services has seen a 23% increase in fraud versus last year, and 46% of document fraud targets national ID cards. If you'd like to learn more, get your free copy by clicking the link in the show notes. Goodbye for now, and I hope you join us again next time.